one Venezuelan sub, one U.S. carrier, the escalation nobody wanted. Let me take you back to July 11th of this year. The Pentagon releases a routine statement, just 3 paragraphs, buried on page 8 of most major newspapers, announcing that the USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group has been redirected to the Caribbean. The official reason? A show of force in response to Venezuela's recent naval exercises, which included the deployment of a diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, in waters near Trinidad and Tobago. The U.S. claims this was a provocative act, a threat to regional stability. Venezuela, for its part, insists it was a standard training mission in its own territorial waters. At first glance, this looks like just another episode in the long, tiresome saga of U.S.-Venezuela tensions. Another round of posturing, another exchange of diplomatic barbs, another forgettable footnote in the broader story of American hegemony in Latin America. But here's I've spent the last 3 decades studying crisis escalation, naval warfare, and the hidden mechanics of great power competition. And what I see in this seemingly minor incident is something far more dangerous, a slow-motion collision between 2 nuclear-armed superpowers, with Venezuela as the unwilling proxy. This isn't just about a submarine and a carrier. It's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order, the return of spheres of influence, and the quiet, desperate struggle of a declining empire to hold on to its dominance. And if we're not careful, it could spiral into something none of us want. Let me tell you why this matters more than the headlines suggest. The official what they want you to believe. The story, as it's being sold to the public, goes something like Venezuela, under the authoritarian rule of Nicolas Maduro, is a rogue state, sanctioned, isolated, and increasingly aggressive. Its recent naval exercises, which included the Caribe submarine operating near Trinidad, were a direct challenge to U.S. regional dominance. The Harry S. Truman Strike Group, one of the most powerful naval formations in the world, was dispatched to send a clear "Don't test us." The U.S. insists this is purely defensive, a necessary response to protect its interests and those of its allies. The media, for the most part, has echoed this framing. CNN called it a firm but measured response. The Wall Street Journal described it as a calibrated show of strength. Even some Latin American governments, particularly those aligned with Washington, have cautiously endorsed the move, framing it as a stabilizing force in a volatile region. The numbers seem to support this narrative. The Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group is a floating city of destruction, 70 aircraft, 5,000 sailors, guided missile cruisers and destroyers bristling with Tomahawk missiles. The Caribe, by contrast, is a 20-year-old diesel-electric submarine, a relic of the Cold War, with limited range and no nuclear capability. On paper, this looks like a mismatch. The U.S. is flexing, Venezuela is bluffing. Case closed. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete, it's actively misleading. Because what's really happening here isn't about Venezuela at all. It's about the United States, Russia, and China playing a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess, with Caracas as the unwilling pawn. And if we don't understand the real dynamics at play, we're sleepwalking into a crisis that could have consequences far beyond the Caribbean. Deconstructing the what's really going on. Let's start with the most obvious why now. Venezuela has had submarines for decades. The Caribe isn't new, it's a refurbished Type 209 sub, a design that's been around since the 1970s. So why is the U.S. suddenly treating its deployment as an existential threat? The answer lies in what happened before July 11th. In late June, just 2 weeks prior to the Truman's redeployment, Russia's Admiral Gorshkov frigate, a state-of-the-art warship equipped with hypersonic Zircon missiles, made an unannounced port call in Havana. This wasn't just any visit. The Gorshkov is one of the most advanced vessels in the Russian Navy, and its presence in the Caribbean sent a clear Moscow is back in America's backyard. The U.S. responded with its own show of force, scrambling F-16s to intercept Russian bombers near Alaska. But the real message was in the timing. The Gorshkov's visit coincided with a series of high-level meetings between Russian and Venezuelan officials in Caracas, where they discussed, among other things, military cooperation and the modernization of Venezuela's aging navy. Now, here's where it gets interesting. According to intelligence sources I've spoken with, the Caribe's deployment wasn't just a routine exercise. It was a demonstration, a test run for a new Russian-Venezuelan naval partnership. The sub was equipped with Russian advisors, and its mission profile included simulated attacks on a U.S. carrier strike group. This wasn't about Venezuela threatening Trinidad. It was about Venezuela, with Russian backing, signaling that it could disrupt U.S. naval dominance in the region if push came to shove. But why would Russia care? Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader contest for influence in Latin America, a region the U.S. has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. Since the Monroe Doctrine, Washington has treated any foreign military presence in the Western Hemisphere as a direct challenge to its security. And for the first time since the Cold War, Russia and China are openly defying that principle. China, for its part, has been quietly extending its footprint in the region. It's now the largest trading partner for most of South America, and it's been investing heavily in ports, infrastructure, and, crucially, military ties. Earlier this year, China and Venezuela signed a defense cooperation agreement that included the sale of advanced radar systems and the potential transfer of Chinese drones. Meanwhile, Russia has been supplying Venezuela with everything from Kalashnikovs to fighter jets, and it's been using the country as a staging ground for its own naval operations in the Atlantic. So when the Caribbean surfaced near Trinidad, it wasn't just a Venezuelan move. It was a Russian move. And the U.S. response, the Truman Strike Group, wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about sending a message to Moscow, and we still control these waters. But here's the: neither Russia nor China actually wants a direct confrontation with the U.S. over Venezuela. What they do want is to erode American dominance in the region, to force Washington to recognize that its unipolar moment is over, and to establish a multipolar world where great powers have their own spheres of influence. And the best way to do that? By making the U.S. overreact. Which is exactly what's happening. The broader geopolitical, the return of spheres of influence. To understand why this is so dangerous, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. The post-Cold War era was defined by American unipolarity, a world where the U.S. was the sole superpower, where NATO extended eastward, where Washington could intervene in conflicts from the Balkans to Iraq with little pushback. But that era is ending. Russia and China have spent the last 2 decades systematically challenging U.S. dominance, not by directly confronting it, but by creating alternative power centers, new institutions, new alliances, new economic blocs that operate outside the U.S.-led order. This is what the political scientists call the return of spheres of influence. And it's the single most destabilizing trend in global politics today. For Russia, Latin America is a way to distract and weaken the U.S. by opening a second front. Moscow knows it can't compete with Washington in Europe, so it's forcing the U.S. to divide its attention. Every dollar the Pentagon spends patrolling the Caribbean is a dollar it's not spending in the South China Sea or the Black Sea. Every diplomatic crisis in Venezuela is a crisis that pulls U.S. resources away from Ukraine or Taiwan. For China, Latin America is about resources and markets. The region is rich in oil, lithium, copper, and soybeans, all critical for China's economy. But it's also about geopolitics. Beijing wants to demonstrate that it can project power globally, that it can protect its allies, and that it can challenge U.S. hegemony without firing a shot. And it's doing this not through military force, but through economic statecraft, loans, infrastructure projects, and trade deals that bind Latin American countries to China's orbit. The U.S., for its part, is trapped in a paradox. On one hand, it still sees itself as the indispensable nation, the guarantor of global order. On the other hand, it's increasingly clear that it can't sustain that role. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan proved that the U.S. can't impose its will through force alone. The rise of China and the resurgence of Russia have shown that other powers are willing and able to challenge American dominance. And yet, Washington keeps acting as if the old rules still apply, as if it can still dictate terms to the world. This is the core of the problem. The U.S. is trying to maintain a unipolar order in a multipolar world. And the result is a series of self-defeating policies, sanctions that don't work, military deployments that don't deter, and diplomatic blunders that alienate allies. Venezuela is just the latest example. Military and strategic, the illusion of control. Now, let's talk about the military dimension of this crisis. Because while the Truman Strike Group is an impressive display of American power, it's also a potential liability. First, the capabilities. The Harry S. Truman is a Nimitz-class carrier, one of the most advanced warships in the world. Its air wing includes F/A-18 Super Hornets, E-2 Hawkeye early warning aircraft, and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare planes. It's escorted by guided missile cruisers and destroyers, all equipped with Aegis combat systems and Tomahawk cruise missiles. In a conventional war, this force would be nearly unstoppable. But here's the we're not in a conventional war. We're in a gray zone conflict, where the rules are different. And in this kind of conflict, the Truman is both a sword and a target. Venezuela's Caribe submarine is old, but it's not irrelevant. Diesel-electric subs are quiet, hard to detect, and deadly in coastal waters. In 2005, a Chinese Song-class sub, a similar design to the Caribe, surfaced undetected within torpedo range of the USS Kitty Hawk carrier strike group. The US didn't even know it was there until the sub broke the surface. If the Caribe had been equipped with modern Russian torpedoes or anti-ship missiles, it could have posed a real threat to the Truman. But the real danger isn't the Caribe itself. It's the precedent it sets. If Venezuela, with Russian and Chinese backing, can force the US to deploy a carrier strike group every time it conducts a naval exercise, then Washington is playing right into Moscow and Beijing's hands. The US Navy is already stretched thin. It has to cover the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Middle East, and the Arctic. Every time it redeploys a carrier to the Caribbean, it's taking resources away from somewhere else. And that's exactly what Russia and China want. Then there's the escalation risk. The US has a long history of miscalculating in Latin America. The Bay of Pigs. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Iran-Contra affair. In each case, Washington assumed it could control the outcome, only to find itself trapped in a spiral of unintended consequences. The same thing could happen here. If the Truman Strike Group gets into a standoff with Venezuelan or Russian forces, even a minor incident, a miscommunication, a collision, a stray shot, could escalate into a full-blown crisis. And let's not forget the lessons of history. The US has a habit of overestimating its ability to control events on the ground. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, all were supposed to be quick, decisive victories. All turned into quagmires. Venezuela is no different. The country is a powder keg. Its economy is in freefall. Its government is desperate. And its military is deeply divided. If the US thinks it can just sail in, flex its muscles, and sail out without consequences, it's deluding itself. The domestic political why this is happening now. Of course, none of this happens in a vacuum. There's a domestic political angle here, too, and it's just as important as the geopolitical one. Let's be the Biden administration didn't want this crisis. It has its hands full with Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. The last thing it needs is another front in Latin America. But here's the thing about foreign: it's never just about foreign policy. It's also about domestic politics. And right now, the White House is under immense pressure to look tough. The 2024 election is looming, and Biden's approval ratings are underwater. The Republican Party has spent the last 3 years painting him as weak on national security. Trump and his allies have been hammering the administration over the border crisis, over Ukraine, over China. And now, with Venezuela in the news, they're seizing on this as another example of Biden's failure to lead. This is where things get dangerous. Because when domestic politics drive foreign policy, bad decisions happen. The White House knows that if it doesn't respond forcefully to Venezuela's naval exercises, it will be accused of appeasement. And so it's doing what every administration does in this: it's overreacting. But here's the overreaction is exactly what Russia and China want. They want the US to get bogged down in Venezuela. They want Washington to look like the aggressor. And they want the American public to start questioning whether their government is spending billions of dollars on carrier strike groups while the economy struggles at home. This is how great powers lose wars, not on the battlefield, but in the court of public opinion. And right now, the US is playing right into its adversary's hands. Scenario where this could go. So where does this go from here? Let's run through the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the Truman Strike Group completes its show of force, Venezuela backs down, and both sides declare victory. The U.S. claims it has deterred further provocations. Venezuela insists it stood up to American bullying. Russia and China issue stern statements but do nothing more. The crisis fades from the headlines, and everyone moves on. This is the least bad outcome. But even here, there are costs. The U.S. has reinforced the perception that it's still the world's policeman, even as its ability to play that role declines. Russia and China have demonstrated that they can challenge U.S. dominance in Latin America without firing a shot. And Venezuela has shown that it can provoke Washington without suffering immediate consequences. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, the standoff continues, but it doesn't escalate into direct conflict. The Truman stays in the Caribbean for a few more weeks, conducting exercises and shadowing Venezuelan naval movements. Russia and China increase their support for Maduro, sending more advisors, more weapons, and more economic aid. The U.S. responds with additional sanctions, but they have little effect. Venezuela's economy continues to collapse, but the government survives. This is the new normal, a low-intensity Cold War in Latin America, with Venezuela as the battleground. The U.S. is stuck in a cycle of endless posturing, while Russia and China slowly erode its influence in the region. It's not a disaster, but it's not a victory either. It's just more of the same, more instability, more division, more wasted resources. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. This is the scenario no one wants, but no one can rule out. In this version of events, the standoff escalates. A Venezuelan patrol boat gets too close to the Truman. A warning shot is fired. Venezuela responds by seizing a U.S. commercial vessel, claiming it's a spy ship. The U.S. retaliates with airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets. Russia and China condemn the strikes, and Moscow sends more warships to the Caribbean. The U.S. responds by imposing a naval blockade on Venezuela. Maduro declares a state of emergency, and the country descends into chaos. This is how wars start, not with a bang, but with a series of miscalculations. And the scariest part? None of the major players actually want this outcome. But once the escalation ladder starts, it's hard to get off. Grand strategy: the death spiral of liberal hegemony. So how did we get here? How did the world's sole superpower find itself trapped in a cycle of endless crises, with no clear path to victory? The answer lies in the grand strategy that has guided U.S. foreign policy since the end of the cold liberal hegemony. The idea behind liberal hegemony is the U.S. should use its unmatched power to shape the world in its own image. It should promote democracy, free markets, and human rights. It should contain rivals like Russia and China. And it should maintain a global military presence to deter aggression and enforce the rules-based order. On paper, this sounds noble. In practice, it's been a disaster. For the last 3 decades, the U.S. has been trying to do too much with too little. It has intervened in conflicts it didn't understand, in countries it couldn't control. It has alienated allies with its arrogance and enemies with its hypocrisy. And it has failed to recognize that the world is changing, that other powers are rising, that the old rules no longer apply. The result is a grand strategy that is both unsustainable and self-defeating. The U.S. is overextended, overcommit, and overconfident. Now, what most people don't realize is that this overstretch isn't just a matter of bad policy, it's a structural flaw in how the U.S. conceives of its own power. The Truman's deployment to the Caribbean isn't an isolated incident. It's the latest symptom of a military that has been running on fumes for decades. The U.S. Navy, once the undisputed master of the seas, now struggles to maintain a fleet of 300 ships, down from nearly 600 at the height of the Cold War. The 2023 China Military Power Report from the Pentagon estimates that the People's Liberation Army Navy has surpassed the U.S. in total hull count, with over 370 ships and submarines, and is on track to reach 435 by 2030. Meanwhile, the U.S. is decommissioning ships faster than it can build them, with the Columbia-class submarine program America's best hope for maintaining undersea dominance, plagued by delays and cost overruns. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. has long relied on its carrier strike groups as the ultimate symbol of its global reach, but these floating airfields are increasingly vulnerable. China's DF-21D carrier killer missile, with a range of over 1,500 kilometers, can now hold U.S. carriers at risk in the Western Pacific. Russia's Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, deployed in Venezuela as part of their joint exercises in 2019, could do the same in the Caribbean. And yet, the U.S. continues to act as if these platforms are invincible, dispatching them into contested waters like the Truman's current deployment, as if daring adversaries to call its bluff. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. is still fighting the last war, or, more accurately, the last three wars. The post-9/11 era trained the military to prioritize counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, but the future belongs to great power competition. The 2018 National Defense Strategy recognized this shift, declaring that interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern in U.S. national security. Yet 5 years later, the U.S. is still structured to fight insurgents in the Middle East rather than peer adversaries in the South China Sea or the Caribbean. The Army's Future Vertical Lift program, designed to replace aging helicopters, is years behind schedule. The Air Force's next-generation air dominance fighter, meant to counter China's J-20, won't enter service until the 2030s. And the Navy's Constellation-class frigate, a critical component of its distributed maritime operations concept, has seen its first ship delayed until at least 2026. This isn't just a procurement problem, it's a strategic one. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades perfecting the art of projecting power into landlocked countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, but it has forgotten how to fight for control of the global commons. The Truman's deployment to Venezuela isn't just about sending a message to Maduro, it's about reassuring allies that the U.S. can still dominate the seas. But what happens when the next crisis erupts in the Taiwan Strait, where China's anti-access/area denial capabilities make U.S. carrier operations far riskier? What happens when Russia, emboldened by its success in Syria and Ukraine, decides to challenge U.S. naval supremacy in the Mediterranean or the Arctic? The answer is that the U.S. will find itself in a position it hasn't been in since the 19th, forced to choose between escalation and retreat. And that's where the real danger lies. Because in a world where the U.S. can no longer take its military dominance for granted, every crisis becomes a test of credibility. Every deployment becomes a gamble. Every warning shot becomes a potential casus belli. Take the Truman's current mission. On paper, it's a routine freedom of navigation operation, a reminder that the U.S. won't tolerate Venezuelan claims to the Caribbean. But in reality, it's a high-stakes game of chicken. The U.S. is betting that Maduro won't call its bluff, that Russia won't escalate, that China won't see an opportunity to exploit American distraction. But what if they do? What if a Venezuelan patrol boat misinterprets a U.S. maneuver as an act of aggression? What if a Russian frigate, shadowing the Truman, decides to intervene? What if China, watching from the sidelines, decides to send its own carrier into the South China Sea as a show of force? This is the paradox of liberal hegemony. The more the U.S. tries to enforce the rules-based order, the more it finds itself trapped by its own commitments. The more it projects power, the more it invites challenges to that power. And the more it relies on military deterrence, the more it risks stumbling into conflicts it can't control. Now, I'm not arguing that the U.S. should retreat into isolationism. That would be just as dangerous as the current overstretch. But what's needed is a fundamental rethinking of how America wields its power. The Truman's deployment to Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the future of U.S. grand strategy. And right now, that future looks increasingly uncertain. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just playing out on the high seas, it's also unfolding in the domestic political arenas of both Venezuela and the United States, where the stakes are just as high, if not higher. Because while the Truman's deployment may look like a straightforward show of force, it's also a deeply political act, one that both governments are using to rally their bases, distract from internal failures, and frame themselves as defenders of national sovereignty. And that's where things get even more dangerous. Let's start with Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro has spent the last decade consolidating power through a mix of repression, economic mismanagement, and outright fraud. The 2018 presidential election, widely condemned as neither free nor fair, was just the latest in a long line of moves to ensure his grip on power. But here's the: Maduro's legitimacy has always been fragile. The economy is in shambles, GDP has contracted by more than 75% since 2013, inflation has hit hyperinflationary levels, and more than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. The opposition, led by figures like Juan Guaidó, has been fractured and weakened, but Maduro still can't claim genuine popular support. His approval ratings hover around 20%, and even within his own party, there are whispers of discontent. So what does a leader like Maduro do when he's facing an existential crisis at home? He manufactures an external enemy. And right now, that enemy is the United States. The Truman's deployment isn't just a military challenge, it's a gift to Maduro's propaganda machine. He can frame this as proof that Venezuela is under siege by imperialist forces, that his government is the last line of defense against foreign aggression. We've seen this playbook before. In 2002, Hugo Chavez used a failed coup attempt to rally his base and purge the military of dissenters. In 2019, Maduro used the threat of U.S. intervention to justify cracking down on protests and consolidating control over the armed forces. Now, he's doing it again. The problem is that this strategy works up to Maduro's core supporters, the so-called Chavistas, will rally around the flag, as they always do. The military, which has been bought off with control over lucrative smuggling routes and gold mines, will likely stay loyal, at least in the short term. But here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's hold on power isn't as secure as it seems. The military is a black box, no one outside a small circle of generals knows how deep the loyalty runs. And while the US may not be planning a full-scale invasion, even a limited strike or a naval blockade could trigger a cascade of defections. Remember, in 2019, a small group of soldiers briefly rose up against Maduro in an attempted coup. The uprising failed, but it showed that the cracks in the regime are real. Now, let's turn to the United States. The Truman's deployment isn't just about Venezuela, it's also about domestic politics. The Biden administration is facing a perfect storm of inflation, a border crisis, a looming election, and a Republican Party that has made Venezuela a key talking point in its broader critique of Biden's foreign policy. For years, Republicans have accused Democrats of being soft on Maduro, pointing to the Obama administration's tentative engagement with the regime and the Trump administration's more aggressive stance, which included sanctions, recognition of Guaidó, and even a failed coup attempt in 2020. Now, with the 2024 election on the horizon, Biden can't afford to look weak. But here's where things get complicated. The US has been down this road before. In 1961, the Kennedy administration greenlit the Bay of Pigs invasion, a disastrous attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro that ended in humiliation. In 1983, Reagan ordered the invasion of Grenada after a Marxist coup, a move that was popular at home but did little to change the broader dynamics of the Cold War. In 2003, Bush invaded Iraq on the pretext of WMDs, a decision that has haunted U.S. foreign policy ever since. The lesson from all of these cases is the military interventions are easy to start but nearly impossible to control. And in Venezuela, the risks are even higher. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. has two broad options in containment or regime change. Containment, which is what the Biden administration has been pursuing, involves sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and limited military pressure. The goal isn't to overthrow Maduro but to force him to negotiate. The problem is that this strategy has failed for years. Sanctions have hurt the Venezuelan people far more than they've hurt the regime, and Maduro has shown no interest in real negotiations. The 2021 talks in Mexico, mediated by Norway, collapsed after the U.S. extradited a key Maduro ally, Alex Saab, on money laundering charges. Maduro walked away, and the opposition was left empty-handed. Regime change, on the other hand, is a much riskier proposition. The U.S. could try to arm and support opposition groups, as it did in Syria, but Venezuela's military is far more cohesive than Syria's was at the start of its civil war. It could launch a limited strike, as Trump reportedly considered in 2019, but that would almost certainly lead to a protracted conflict with unpredictable consequences. Or it could attempt a full-scale invasion, which would be a logistical nightmare given Venezuela's size, terrain, and the fact that Russia and Iran have deep ties to the regime. Here's the neither option is particularly appealing. Containment isn't working, but regime change could be catastrophic. And yet, the pressure to do something is growing. The Republican Party has made Venezuela a key issue, with figures like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz framing Maduro as a threat to U.S. national security. The media, too, has played a role. Outlets like Fox News have hyped the idea of a Venezuelan invasion, while more mainstream outlets have framed the Truman's deployment as a necessary response to Maduro's aggression. The result is a feedback loop where political pressure forces the administration to take a harder line, which in turn raises the risk of escalation. Now, let's talk about the scenarios. There are three broad possibilities here, each with its own set of risks. The first is that this remains a war of words. The Truman conducts its freedom of navigation operations, Maduro issues fiery speeches, and nothing actually happens. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most unstable. Because in a crisis like this, miscalculation is always a risk. A Venezuelan patrol boat gets too close to the Truman. A U.S. fighter jet buzzes a Russian frigate. A cyber attack is misinterpreted as an act of war. Any of these could spiral into a larger conflict. The second scenario is that the U.S. ramps up the pressure. Sanctions get tighter, covert operations increase, and the military presence in the region grows. This could force Maduro to the negotiating table, but it could also push him into a corner. If he feels his back is against the wall, he might lash out either by attacking U.S. assets, as Iran did in the Persian Gulf, or by doubling down on repression at home. Remember, Maduro has already survived multiple coup attempts and mass protests. He's not going to go quietly. The third scenario is the most a direct confrontation. This could happen in a number of ways. A Venezuelan submarine, perhaps one of the aging Kilo-class boats Russia has sold to Caracas, could attempt to shadow the Truman. A U.S. drone could be shot down. A Russian or Iranian vessel could intervene. Any of these could trigger a response from the U.S., which in turn could lead to a broader conflict. And here's the once the shooting starts, it's very hard to stop. The U.S. has a long history of mission creep, look at Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. What starts as a limited operation can quickly become a full-blown war. So where does that leave us? The uncomfortable truth is that the U.S. is trapped in a paradox of its own making. It can't afford to look weak, but it also can't afford to escalate. It can't walk away from Venezuela, but it also can't fix the problem with military force. And the longer this standoff continues, the greater the risk of miscalculation. Now, I'm not saying that war is inevitable. Far from it. But what I am saying is that the current approach isn't sustainable. The U.S. needs a new strategy, one that recognizes the limits of military power and the dangers of overreach. That means working with allies in the region, like Colombia and Brazil, to isolate Maduro diplomatically. It means offering targeted sanctions relief in exchange for real concessions, rather than blanket measures that hurt ordinary Venezuelans. And it means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and that the best the U.S. can do is contain the damage. But here's the none of this is politically palatable. In an election year, no administration wants to be seen as soft on a dictator. And in a media environment that thrives on conflict, nuance is often the first casualty. The result is a policy that's stuck in limbo, neither escalating nor de-escalating, but instead lurching from one crisis to the end. And that, in the end, is the real danger. Because in a world where the U.S. is no longer the undisputed hegemon, where Russia and China are actively challenging American power, and where domestic politics are increasingly polarized, the risk of stumbling into a conflict nobody wanted is higher than it's been in decades. The Truman's deployment to Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power and whether the U.S. can still navigate a world that no longer bends to its will. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of the entire post-Cold War order. The Truman's deployment to the Caribbean isn't an isolated incident, it's a symptom of a much deeper crisis in American grand strategy. For decades, the U.S. operated under the assumption that military primacy would guarantee stability, that economic leverage would translate into political influence, and that adversaries would eventually bend to Washington's will. But that world is gone. The question now is whether the U.S. can adapt or whether it will keep doubling down on a playbook that no longer works. Let me explain why this matters. The last time the US faced a crisis like this was in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy and Khrushchev stared into the abyss and pulled back. But here's the uncomfortable: today's standoff is far more dangerous because the rules of the game have changed. Back then, the US and the Soviet Union had clear red lines, back-channel communications, and a shared understanding that mutual destruction was unacceptable. Today, we have none of that. Maduro isn't Khrushchev, he's a weakened autocrat with nothing to lose, backed by a Russia that sees chaos as a strategic asset. And the US? It's a superpower with a fraying attention, a Congress that can't agree on anything, and a public that has no appetite for another forever war. So what are the alternatives? The first, and most obvious, is de-escalation. That doesn't mean surrendering to Maduro, it means recognizing that the current approach of maximum pressure has failed. The US could start by lifting some of the most punitive sanctions, like those on Venezuela's oil sector, in exchange for verifiable democratic reforms. It could work with the UN to broker a power-sharing agreement, even if that means accepting Maduro as a transitional figure. And it could stop treating Venezuela as a zero-sum game with Russia and China. After all, if the goal is to stabilize the country, then working with Beijing and Moscow, who have their own interests in avoiding a collapse, might be the only way to get Maduro to the table. The second alternative is containment. If Maduro isn't going anywhere, then the US should focus on limiting his ability to export instability. That means strengthening Colombia's border defenses, cracking down on Venezuelan arms trafficking, and working with Brazil to prevent Maduro from turning the region into a hub for Russian and Iranian influence. It also means accepting that regime change is off the table for now and instead focusing on managing the humanitarian crisis. The US could increase aid to Venezuelan refugees, work with the International Monetary Fund to stabilize the economy, and even offer temporary protected status to Venezuelans already in the US. None of this is ideal, but it's better than the current policy of hoping Maduro will somehow disappear. The third alternative is the one no one in Washington wants to talk: disengagement. The US could simply walk away, declaring that Venezuela is no longer a core national security interest. That's not as crazy as it sounds. After all, the US has tolerated far worse regimes in the past. Think of Saudi Arabia, or Pakistan, or even North Korea. The difference is that Venezuela isn't a nuclear-armed state, and it doesn't sit on the world's largest oil reserves. It's a broken country with a broken leader, and the US has far bigger fish to fry, like China's rise in the Pacific, Russia's war in Ukraine, and the looming crisis in the Middle East. If the choice is between another quagmire in Latin America and focusing on the real threats to American power, then disengagement might be the least bad option. But here's the: none of these alternatives are politically viable in an election year. The Biden administration is already under fire from Republicans for being too soft on Maduro, and any move toward de-escalation would be framed as appeasement. Meanwhile, the hawks in Congress are pushing for even tougher measures, like designating Venezuela as a state sponsor of terrorism or imposing secondary sanctions on foreign commies that do business with Caracas. And the media? It's already treating this as a new Cold War, with Maduro as the latest Bond villain. Nuance doesn't sell, and in a world of 24-hour news cycles, the only thing that matters is who's winning and who's losing. That's why the most likely outcome is more of the slow-motion escalation, where the US and Venezuela dance closer and closer to the edge without ever quite falling off. The Truman will stay in the Caribbean, Maduro will keep playing the nationalist card, and both sides will hope that the other blinks first. But hope isn't a strategy. And in a world where miscalculation is the greatest risk, that's a dangerous game to play. So where does that leave us? With a choice between bad options and worse ones. The US can try to contain Maduro, but that will require patience and diplomacy, two things that are in short supply in Washington. It can try to disengage, but that would mean admitting that American power has limits, which is politically toxic. Or it can keep doing what it's doing, hoping that anything will break its way. But history tells us that's not how these things end. The real question isn't whether the US can afford to walk away from Venezuela. It's whether it can afford not to. Because in a world where the old rules no longer apply, the greatest risk isn't that America will do too little, it's that it will do too much. And in the end, that might be the most dangerous escalation of all.